The grand ballroom of the Vandermeer estate in Newport, Rhode Island, glittered like a jewel box under the light of three massive crystal chandeliers. It was the summer of 1895, and America's wealthiest families had gathered for what society columnists were calling the season's most anticipated event. The air hung thick with the scent of imported roses and expensive perfumes, mingling with the faint salt breeze drifting in from the Atlantic through the open French doors. Margaret Eleanor Hartwell stood near the edge of the dance floor, her gloved hands clutching a silk fan painted with Japanese cherry blossoms. At 23, she was considered dangerously close to spinsterhood by Newport's exacting standards, though her beauty remained undeniable. Her auburn hair was arranged in an elaborate Gibson girl style, and her gown, a creation of pale ivory silk with delicate gold embroidery, had cost her widowed mother nearly their entire quarterly allowance. It had to be perfect. Tonight was Margaret's last chance to secure a suitable match before her family's dwindling finances became common knowledge among the ruthless social circles of the Gilded Age elite. Across the ballroom, Alexander Thornton Blackwood, the Duke of Ashford, surveyed the crowd with practiced indifference. At 52, he was still considered one of the most eligible bachelors on 2 continents, though his reputation was far from pristine. The elder Duke had buried 2 wives, built a railroad empire that spanned from Boston to San Francisco, and collected enemies with the same efficiency he collected art. His silver-streaked dark hair and piercing grey eyes gave him a distinguished appearance that younger men envied and society matrons found irresistible. He had sailed from London specifically for this event, though he found American social gatherings exhausting with their desperate peacocking and nouveau riche pretensions. The orchestra began a Viennese waltz, and couples flooded onto the polished marble floor. Margaret felt her mother's sharp elbow in her ribs, a not-so-subtle reminder of her duty. She needed to be seen, to be noticed, to capture someone's attention before the season ended. But as she scanned the room for potential partners, her eyes accidentally locked with those of the Duke of Ashford. Time seemed to suspend itself in that moment. Alexander had been reaching for his champagne glass when he saw her, this young woman with fire in her auburn hair and something indefinable in her expression. It was not the simpering eagerness he had grown accustomed to from debutantes. There was intelligence there and pride, and perhaps a hint of desperation she was working hard to conceal. He found himself unable to look away. Margaret felt her breath catch. The Duke was staring at her with an intensity that made her skin flush beneath her corset. She should look away, she knew. It was improper to hold a gentleman's gaze so boldly, especially one of his stature and reputation. But something held her frozen in place, as if an invisible thread had been drawn tight between them across the crowded ballroom. Mrs. Caroline Hartwell noticed the exchange and felt her heart begin to race. The Duke of Ashford. Every mother in Newport had been trying to secure his attention for their daughters since he arrived 3 weeks ago. He had danced with precisely no one, attended only the most exclusive gatherings, and made it abundantly clear he found American society tedious. Yet now he was staring at Margaret as if she were the only person in the room. Alexander set down his glass with deliberate precision. He crossed the ballroom floor with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. The crowd seemed to part before him instinctively, conversations dying as people recognized his approach. He stopped directly in front of Margaret, his tall frame towering over her more delicate height. Up close, his eyes were even more compelling, storm grey with flecks of silver that matched the threads in his hair. The Duke extended his hand without preamble. His English accent carried across the sudden silence that had fallen around them. Margaret placed her gloved hand in his, feeling the strength of his grip even through the layers of silk. He led her onto the dance floor as the waltz swelled to its most romantic passage. As his arm circled her waist and they began to move together, Alexander leaned close enough that only she could hear his words. What he whispered made Margaret's eyes widen in shock, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. The dance had begun, but this was no ordinary courtship. The morning after the Vandermeer ball, Newport's elite gathered at the Ocean Lawn Tennis Club, though few paid attention to the matches. Every conversation centered on one topic: the Duke of Ashford's unprecedented attention to Margaret Hartwell. They had danced 3 times, a scandalous breach of etiquette that announced his intentions as clearly as a formal declaration. But it was their private conversation on the terrace afterward that had tongues wagging, witnessed by Mrs. Astor herself through the French doors. Margaret sat in the morning room of their rented cottage on Bellevue Avenue, staring at the cream-colored card that had arrived with breakfast. The Duke of Ashford requested the pleasure of her company for a drive along Ocean Drive that afternoon. Her mother was practically vibrating with excitement, already planning the wedding announcement. But Margaret remembered what he had whispered to her during their waltz, and her hands trembled slightly as she held the invitation. Alexander had been brutally honest with her. He needed a wife for social appearances and to satisfy his family's demands for an heir. In return, he would pay off her family's debts, secure her mother's future, and provide Margaret with wealth and status beyond her wildest dreams. But there would be conditions. Their marriage would be one of convenience, not love. He would expect discretion, obedience, and most importantly, she would never question his business dealings or personal affairs. He was offering her a transaction, not a romance. At precisely 2 o'clock, a gleaming black Daimler motor car pulled up in front of the Hartwell cottage, causing neighbors to rush to their windows. Motorcars were still rare enough in Newport to draw attention, and the Duke's German-made vehicle was rumored to have cost more than most people earned in a decade. Alexander stepped out, wearing a perfectly tailored driving coat and leather gloves, looking every inch the wealthy aristocrat he was. Margaret wore a walking dress of dove grey with a matching hat adorned with ostrich feathers. As Alexander handed her into the motor car, she noticed the calluses on his palms, despite his gentleman's appearance. These were the hands of a man who had built his empire through more than inherited privilege. They drove in silence through Newport's gilded streets, past the massive cottages that were really marble palaces, until they reached the dramatic coastline where the Atlantic crashed against ancient rocks. Alexander finally spoke as they watched the waves. He told her about his first wife, a British aristocrat who had died in childbirth along with their son. His second wife had been a French heiress who preferred laudanum to reality and eventually took too much, whether intentionally or not, was never determined. He was finished with romantic illusions and the complications that came with emotional entanglements. What he needed was a partner who understood the arrangement was purely practical. Margaret listened with growing understanding. She had her own reasons for accepting such an arrangement. Her father had gambled away their fortune before drinking himself to death 2 years ago. Her mother's health was failing, and without funds for proper medical care, she would not survive another harsh winter in their drafty Boston townhouse. Margaret had no illusions about love either. She had watched her parents' marriage crumble under the weight of her father's addictions and her mother's bitter disappointment. Perhaps a marriage without pretense of affection would be more honest than most. She turned to face him directly, her chin lifted with the pride he had noticed the night before. Margaret asked him what he truly wanted from her beyond the social performance. Alexander studied her for a long moment before answering. He wanted someone intelligent enough to manage his households, strong enough to withstand scrutiny from society, and practical enough to accept that while he would be faithful in public, his private life was his own. In return, she would have complete financial freedom, social prestige, and his protection from anyone who might try to harm her or her family. The ocean wind whipped around them as Margaret considered his offer. It was cold-blooded and calculating, everything she had been taught to avoid in courtship, but it was also honest in a way that most society marriages were not. At least she would know exactly what she was agreeing to, without the false promises of devotion that so often curdled into resentment. She thought of her mother's medical bills, their mounting debts, the humiliation of poverty creeping ever closer. Margaret gave him her answer, and Alexander's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Something that might have been relief, or perhaps satisfaction, flickered across his distinguished features. He reached into his coat and produced a small velvet box. Inside was a ring that made Margaret gasp despite herself, an enormous sapphire surrounded by diamonds, clearly worth a fortune. As he slid it onto her finger, Alexander made one thing perfectly clear. She would be his duchess, his wife in every public sense, but she must never expect him to love her, and she must never fall in love with him. That was the one rule he would not bend on. Margaret agreed, certain she could keep her heart safe. She had no idea how wrong she would be. News of the engagement spread through Newport society like wildfire. Within hours of Alexander's formal announcement, the Hartwell cottage was flooded with calling cards, invitations, and thinly veiled attempts to extract gossip. Mrs. Caroline Hartwell received visitors in their modest drawing room with newfound confidence, carefully omitting any mention of the businesslike nature of her daughter's upcoming marriage. To the outside world, it was a fairy tale. The impoverished but beautiful American girl capturing the heart of one of England's wealthiest dukes. Margaret spent the following days in a whirlwind of preparations that felt more like negotiating a corporate merger than planning a wedding. Alexander's attorneys arrived from New York with contracts that specified everything from her allowance to her social obligations to the disposition of any children they might have. She read every page carefully, noting how thoroughly he had considered every possible scenario. There was even a clause about what would happen if either of them wished to end the marriage. She would retain a generous settlement and property, but any children would remain with him. The financial arrangements were staggering. Alexander paid off her family's debts immediately, all $23,000 of them. He purchased a comfortable house in Boston for her mother, complete with staff, and arranged for the best physicians in the city to attend to Mrs. Hartwell's heart condition. He opened bank accounts in Margaret's name with funds that made her dizzy to contemplate. In return, Margaret signed papers agreeing to certain social obligations and behavioral expectations. She would serve as hostess for his gatherings, accompany him to important events, and present the image of a devoted wife. What happened behind closed doors would remain private. Alexander's sister Victoria arrived from London a week before the wedding, and Margaret immediately understood where the Duke had learned his calculating nature. Lady Victoria Pemberton was elegant, sharp-tongued, and utterly pragmatic. Over tea in the Duke's rented mansion, she explained the reality of Margaret's new position. English society would be watching for any sign of American vulgarity or social missteps. Margaret would need to learn proper forms of address, understand the intricate hierarchy of the aristocracy, and navigate the treacherous waters of London's social season. Victoria offered to serve as her guide, but made it clear she expected Margaret to be a quick study. The wedding took place on a brilliant September morning at Trinity Church in Newport. Margaret wore a gown of ivory silk and Belgian lace that had cost more than her family had spent on clothing in the past 5 years. The church was filled with America's most prominent families, all curious to witness this unlikely union. Alexander stood at the altar in formal morning dress, looking every inch the aristocrat. When Margaret walked down the aisle on the arm of her uncle, she caught her future husband's eyes and saw nothing but cool assessment there. The ceremony itself was brief and traditional. Margaret spoke her vows in a steady voice, promising to honor and obey, feeling the weight of the sapphire engagement ring on her finger. When Alexander placed the wedding band beside it, his hands were steady and his expression unchanged. The kiss he gave her after the priest pronounced them married was chaste and perfunctory, meant for the audience rather than his new bride. As they walked back down the aisle together, Margaret felt as if she had signed away her freedom in the most official way possible. The reception at Alexander's mansion was lavish beyond anything Newport had seen that season. French champagne flowed freely. Orchids imported from South America adorned every surface, and the wedding breakfast featured delicacies from around the world. Margaret played her part perfectly, smiling graciously at guests, accepting congratulations with appropriate modesty, and dancing with her new husband for the traditional first waltz. To everyone watching, they appeared to be a couple entering a promising marriage. But when the guests finally departed and Margaret was led upstairs to the ducal suite, the reality of her situation became crystal clear. Alexander's bedroom adjoined hers through a connecting door, but he made no move to cross the threshold. Instead, he stood in the doorway and informed her that while he would visit her bed occasionally for the purpose of producing an heir, she should not expect romance or intimacy beyond that function. He wished her good night and closed the door, leaving Margaret alone in her elaborate wedding gown in a room filled with expensive furniture that belonged to a stranger. Margaret sat on the edge of the massive four-poster bed and slowly removed her veil. She had known what she was agreeing to, had accepted the terms of this arrangement with open eyes. But knowing intellectually that her marriage would be cold and transactional was different from experiencing the reality of it on her wedding night. She thought of her mother, now comfortable and cared for in Boston. She thought of the debts now paid, the social status now secured. She had made her bargain and would honor it. Through the connecting door, she could hear Alexander moving about his room, the sound of drawers opening and closing, water being poured. He was so close, yet completely separate from her. Margaret unpinned her elaborate hairstyle and let it fall down her back, then began the difficult task of unfastening her wedding gown alone. As she finally slipped between the silk sheets of her new bed, she made herself a promise. She would be the perfect duchess, would fulfill every obligation of their contract, but she would also guard her heart carefully. Alexander Thornton Blackwood would get exactly what he paid for, and not 1 ounce of genuine feeling more. She would not give him the power to hurt her by expecting something he had clearly stated he would never provide. 3 days after the wedding, Margaret stood on the deck of the RMS Lucania as it prepared to depart from New York Harbor. The massive Cunard liner represented the height of luxury transatlantic travel, and Alexander had naturally booked the finest staterooms available. As the ship's horn blasted and tugboats began guiding them toward the open ocean, Margaret watched the New York skyline gradually shrink into the distance. She was leaving America, possibly forever, to begin a life in a country she had only read about in books. Alexander had business associates to entertain during the crossing, which meant Margaret spent most of her time with Lady Victoria. The Duke's sister proved to be an exacting tutor, drilling Margaret relentlessly on the complexities of British aristocratic society. She needed to understand the difference between a viscount and a viscountess, know which titled ladies took precedence over others, and master the art of polite conversation that revealed nothing while appearing to share everything. Victoria was particularly firm about the importance of discretion regarding the true nature of Margaret and Alexander's marriage arrangement. The Atlantic crossing took 6 days, and Margaret found herself studying her new husband from a distance. During the day, Alexander was charming and attentive in public, offering her his arm as they promenaded on deck, ensuring she was comfortable at meals in the first-class dining salon. But once they retired to their adjoining staterooms each evening, he became distant and formal, retreating immediately to his own quarters with barely a word. Margaret began to notice small details. How his jaw tightened when certain business acquaintances approached him, the way his eyes constantly scanned rooms as if assessing threats, how he rarely smiled genuinely. On the 4th night at sea, Margaret woke to the sound of shouting from Alexander's stateroom. She sat up in her bed, heart racing, unsure if she should investigate or maintain the privacy he clearly valued. The sounds continued, raised voices, something heavy falling, then silence. After several minutes, she heard Alexander's door open and close, followed by footsteps retreating down the corridor. Unable to sleep, Margaret wrapped herself in a robe and moved to the small window overlooking the dark ocean. She wondered what demons her new husband carried, what had created such a controlled, emotionally distant man. The next morning at breakfast, Alexander appeared perfectly composed, showing no signs of whatever disturbance had occurred the night before. Margaret wanted to ask if he was well, but his expression made it clear the question would not be welcome. Instead, she focused on her poached eggs and listened as he discussed railroad investments with a Boston financier seated at their table. She was learning to read his moods through subtle signals, the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed against his coffee cup, the slight narrowing of his eyes when someone said something that displeased him. Victoria took Margaret aside that afternoon for what she called a frank discussion. The older woman explained that Alexander had not always been the cold, calculating man Margaret now knew. His first wife's death had devastated him, and his second wife's addiction and subsequent demise had hardened whatever remained of his ability to trust or love. Victoria suggested Margaret not take his emotional distance personally. Her brother had simply decided that feelings were liabilities he could no longer afford in business or in life. The arrangement he had made with Margaret was his way of fulfilling social obligations without risking further emotional damage. As the Lucania approached the Irish coast, Margaret realized she was entering her new life with almost no preparation beyond social etiquette. She knew nothing about managing an English household, understanding British customs beyond what Victoria had taught her, or navigating the complex world of London society that would judge her every move. The prospect was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She had been given an opportunity to reinvent herself, to become someone new. Margaret Eleanor Hartwell of Boston was gone. In her place was Her Grace, the Duchess of Ashford, and she would need to be strong enough to survive in that role. On their final evening at sea, Alexander surprised her by knocking on the connecting door and asking if she would join him for dinner in his stateroom rather than the public dining room. Margaret agreed, curious about this breach in his usual routine. The stewards had set up an intimate table by the window, and as they ate and watched the sunset over the Atlantic, Alexander spoke more openly than he had since their engagement. He told her about Ashford Manor, his estate in Derbyshire, and warned her that English country society could be even more judgmental than London's elite. He also made his expectations clear once again. Margaret would be presented at court, would participate in the London season, and would serve as hostess for important political and business gatherings at both their London townhouse and the country estate. In return, he would provide her with every material comfort and protect her reputation fiercely. But she must remember always that their marriage was a partnership based on mutual benefit, not emotion. As he spoke, Margaret noticed something in his eyes that contradicted his words, a flash of what might have been loneliness or regret, quickly suppressed. When the Lucania docked in Liverpool, Margaret stood beside Alexander as porters handled their extensive luggage. A private train car waited to take them to London, where their new life would truly begin. As the English countryside rolled past the windows, Margaret made a decision. She would honor their agreement and play the role of dutiful Duchess perfectly, but she would also watch and learn, trying to understand the man she had married. Perhaps the cold, distant Duke was not the complete picture. Perhaps beneath the calculated exterior was someone more complex than he wanted the world to see. Margaret told herself she was simply being observant, learning about her new circumstances. She refused to acknowledge the small, dangerous voice, suggesting she might actually be becoming interested in Alexander Thornton Blackwood as more than just a contractual arrangement.